Okay, welcome everyone to the December 14, 2020 FinCom meeting. We have our information on how to access our meeting is published on the town website. We're meeting this evening virtually, and we have several items. Before I introduce the agenda, I'd like to take a roll call, seeing that we have a quorum of members from the FinCom. As I shout out your names, just indicate that you are, in fact, here. Ann Haley?
Here.
Judy Langone?
Here.
Alan Slater?
Here.
Kelly Newmy?
Here.
Guess what? Bob Donnelly's here, too. We have a quorum. We have full membership. And I'd also like to welcome a number of other folks who are on the meeting with us. We have Emily Chambers, David Hajar, Tony Mizuko, Peter Frazier from Hilltop Securities, Lisa Driscoll, also from Hilltop Securities. We have Tom McQuaid, Mark Ryan, Russ McGuire, and Mark Good. Have I missed anyone? Excellent.
Tom Maloney here.
Hi, Tom.
Hello, Robert.
Snuck in under the wire, Tom. Very good. All right, tonight's agenda, the first item is the acceptance of minutes from November 12th. I put a note out earlier. I think if we could postpone that minutes until next meeting, I think there's some editing that we need to do on the meetings as submitted. If that's okay with the commission, we'll move on to the agenda items. Very good. So just one thing, I'd like to switch the agenda on a little bit. Tony has a conflict. Tony needs to attend a storm prep meeting within the hour. So what I'd like to do is, if we could, hear a couple of items from Tony, the update on the FY22 budget planning and timeline. If we have time to do the light department financial structure, we'll try to do that, but I really would like to get the Hilltop folks on board somewhere in the 5 to 5:15 time frame. If the commission is okay with that, we'll proceed first with Tony's agenda. Very good. All right, Tony.
Thank you, Bob. In terms of a budget timeline, we've ready to present what I would call a first pass of a budget timeline. We still have some dates to fill out, and we, of course, haven't talked to any of the various bodies involved with the budget and town meeting, but what we're trying to do this year and hopefully have ready by January is sort of looking at the end and start as a starting point for, we know we're going to have town meeting. I think it's May 10th or May 15th. Let's try to back out now what the timelines are for the budget, as well as some of the informational requirements. So, when does staff have to get the budgets into department leadership? When do we get a first pass to budget balancing? When do we expect budget balancing to make a decision? Then it goes to the various boards. When will the selectmen, the FinCom, the school committee sort of approve their budgets? And just to try to get a timeline out there, there's a word for pre-draft. I would use the word pre-draft, but Tom, can you pull up on your screen the timeline as it is? And what we might do is send this out just for input from everyone from the school committee, the finance commission, and the selectmen, as we don't have every item actually on there. We have some items.
We just considered it sort of the first pass or a draft. We get time to work on it for sure.
So, Tom, if you want to scroll to a little bit of the few of the later dates, just so we can show sort of what we're looking at. So you would have a date, that's when we would hope to have by, and again, these dates are sort of made up at this point, when budget balancing would approve sort of their numbers. Hopefully most expense budgets will be built by then, and then you'd have the selectmen and the school committee approve budgets. The FinCom would approve their budget. The warrant would open. We'd get the draft completed budget document to the FinCom, again, by a certain date, close the warrant. When are we going to record videos? When are we going to have comments due? When are we doing our presentations? I know one thing I hear from the public a lot of times is it would be great if we knew ahead of time when we were actually doing public presentations of the budget material, so we could tell people well enough in advance. Some of the other things we still need to look at, more of an internal document than anything, but the yellow sheets, it's always a rush to get the yellow sheets done and make sure everyone knows where they are. So we are just looking at to try to come up with a simple timeline, try to get everyone to agree to it, understanding that, things are going to change. The FinCom may need to meet a week earlier or a week later. The selectmen might need to meet a week earlier. or a week later. We know it's going to be another tricky budget year in that we're not expecting to hear from the state terribly early. But what we'd like to get out by sometime in January is at least sort of a calendar that we can all agree on that this is the timeline we're going to try to work with. And then including in sort of the town meeting information sessions leading up to what we anticipate being the first day of town meeting.
Bob?
And then Kelly.
I just wanted to say that the school budget committee has started a budget timeline of their own. And I'm sure that if you contact Mrs. Stewart or Karen Sheridan, they will be able to supply it with you. I did not see this before the meeting, so I can't tell you whether or not any of the things are coincide with each other or are in conflict. Just wanted to let you know. Okay.
Sure.
And Kelly, please.
So I think this is excellent. I think this will be a great way to make sure all the different people who need to contribute to it are aligned and all the different boards are aligned to make sure that they're getting, Tony, your team, what they need to make sure they meet these deadlines because they're so critical. So I just wanted to say thank you. The only thing I would ask be added, and it might be in here because I'm blind and can't see everything, is just to put like dates, like if the school committee needs to get you stuff for the warrant, when they need to get that to you and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Excellent. I think this is awesome.
Any other comments or questions about the timeline? Yes, Alan.
Thank you, Bob. This just relates to one of the issues we had the previous town meeting. That's how we should address some of our capital items. The language in the articles and the buckets. I think it's obvious that if we do use this different language, that we will have to have at least several buckets of different types of projects, like projects, where it makes sense to bundle them together. So let's make sure that we have that done early so that all the different groups can look at them, agree to them, and present them to a town meeting without any issues that any of us would have.
Yes, and I just on that point, I think Ann wanted to make that point as well. I think we actually have a item for later in the agenda for capital outlay, and I think that will we can discuss that as well at that point. At this point, are there any other questions about the first pass at a timeline for the FY22 budget? No? Okay, seeing none. Ann, yes. You're muted.
I'm not sure we need to vote on this since it was just presented to us now and haven't had a chance to look at the dates and stuff. I accept it as a piece of information, but I wouldn't want to vote on it.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate that nothing on tonight's agenda is up. I didn't anticipate any votes. Tonight's agenda is basically all informational.
Okay.
Yeah, the schedule's also not ready. It's not just in draft form. I said it's almost pre-draft. We're missing some key items in there.
Okay. So what did you want a motion for, Bob?
I didn't want a motion. No,
Okay.
no motion. I didn't.
All right. Thank you.
No. No, my comment, Ann, was that Alan had some information regarding the capital outlay, and I thought those topics and discussions would be also good under the agenda item for capital outlay for FY22 later in the evening. So with that,
I think Judy's trying to signal you, Bob. Sorry.
you're muted.
Just wondering, is there a capital outlay meeting for fiscal 22 scheduled?
So one of the things capital outlay has been discussing is sort of moving the majority of the capital process to the fall the way we did it this year. It's sort of better for bidding. It's better for construction projects. We should get better prices. That doesn't mean we would do no capital in the spring. As you know, certain projects come up and they have to get approved. So I think what's going to get proposed is a similar to what we did this year, where we'll start going through capital internally. Departments will identify anything that has to get approved in the spring. There's our annual MWRA loan as an example, but by moving it to the fall, we'll be able to take advantage of sort of a better bidding climate. But they're still going to have to meet. We want to give capital outlay a little bit more time to actually do their work. And one of the other benefits of moving it to the fall is we can kind of give it the time it deserves. Whereas we know we already need 3 nights of presentations just to get through sort of the overview and the school and the general government budgets. And the capital outlays for the 4th night. So we're asking people, 4 nights of budget presentations, and it's already going into a 3 or 4 night town meeting. Capital outlay kind of gets jammed all in there. So it'd be better to sort of give it the time it works. And if you think of the way capital outlay is made up, oftentimes those members are on other committees as well. So they're trying to work through the budget and work through the town meeting process and also take care of capital outlay, which is important. I mean, we want to get to a point where capital outlay members are taking tours of facilities and viewing work that's being done and sort of physically seeing the work that's been done in previous years and then looking at the equipment that's being replaced and the work to get done to get them more involved. Moving the timeline would be a little bit more advantageous for all of us. We'll probably also make the spring town meeting a little bit less intense, where we're trying to get through 5 or 6 nights and we're just throwing everything in there.
So Tony,
Well,
this year, yep, I'm sorry, Ann, Judy.
Since I am the liaison from the Finance Commission for fiscal 22, which will be spillover from fiscal 21, I was just wondering if there's some meetings or where I should catch up.
We will, I will reach out to you and we'll get you caught up to where we are. And as soon
Tony,
as-
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Judy, we'll get something set up probably in the next 60 days. You'll be the first to know.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And on that point, Dan, just before I recognize you so on that point, I need to formally appoint Judy to the capital outlay. Is that typically done by way of a letter to Tom, for example?
You just told me, Bob. That's fine. Just
That's fine,
record
okay.
record it in your minutes, and you and I will confer. I know about it, and Tony knows about it. Put it in your minutes. You're all set.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Ann, did you have a comment?
Just quickly, when was the last time the capital outlay group met?
We met sometime prior to the fall meeting, I think, Tom, did we not?
Yeah, we did. We did. I forget the date, but it was right before the fall, in October.
Probably
Yeah.
October.
And I'm sorry, but I'm just looking to understand. Did you actually take a vote on whether or not to do a split capital outlay process at that point? Or is that something that you have to discuss like in January or whenever you meet next?
That's something we're going to discuss when we meet next.
Okay, so it's not a done deal. All right, fine, thank you.
Yep.
Anything else on the budget timeline? Very good. It is now just before 4:45. Tony, I gave you the opportunity we could postpone the light department financials if you're pressed for time. I'm just not aware of how long the presentation would be. What's your preference?
Are you asking me or Peter?
Yeah, Tony. Yes.
Oh, so I can actually get through the presentation in probably 20 minutes if I just go through and we hold questions till the end, and then I can take a few questions. And if there are further questions, we can always come back. It might be good to hear it, go through it, and it's more informational. It's fairly short for me even.
Okay. Yeah, that would be fine. And I asked Tony a few weeks ago if he could put forward the presentation for us. It was given to the selectmen a few weeks ago. I thought it was interesting regarding the financial structure, if you will, of the light department. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tony, for the presentation.
Thank you. Tom, could you make me the presenter so I can share my screen?
Emily's doing that, right?
Somebody is. There we go. Thank you, Emily. All right. Give me just a moment to get started here. All right, if I could confirm everyone can, oh, that's probably the wrong presentation. That looks a little bit better. All right, just confirm everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna go through this fairly quickly, and of course, questions welcome at the end. So just in reviewing the past fiscal year for the light department, The positive year for NLD overall. There are some headwinds approaching. Our peak shaving generators contributed to approximately $600,000 in savings. We were able to sell our RECs or renewable energy credits. Unfortunately, due to legislative action, we will not be able to sell them in the future, which will cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So currently, every year, we're able to sell our renewable energy credits we get from participating in green energy projects for quite a bit of money. Our capacity credits were positive, and the Moderna battery storage was helpful both to them and to us. And we're hoping that battery storage projects like this will take place with large commercial projects in the future. You can see us there in the bottom at the groundbreaking of the ribbon cutting of the new Norwood Light Department facility about a week before most of us got quarantined last year.
Mhm.
So in brief, we're going to go over 7 topics for the light department today: depreciation, the rate shock fund, the operating account or lack thereof, purchase power, rate setting, credit rating, and the bond payoff plan. So depreciation as it relates to a municipal light plant is the calculated loss in value of assets in the MLP annually, which is then raised via rates to ensure regular investment and replacement of plant assets and emergency funding available to ensure that utility operations don't cease. Many of you are familiar with the accounting term depreciation. When we refer to it, it is depreciation, but that dollar amount that the plant depreciates each year must then be raised via rates to reinvest in the plant. It's a statutory requirement of Mass General Law. The current depreciation account, and my numbers are as of September, so they may be off, is around $5.1 million. Depreciation does pay for routine items such as vehicles, equipment, poles, lines, transformers, building repairs and enhancements. We did take $1.4 million out of depreciation for the new building on Access Road to borrow a little bit less. Upcoming projects include replacing the 40-year-old switchgear at the substation, which is at a cost of about $5 million. A substation completely going down could cost upwards of $20 million. And I know that might sound like it's an outrageous item or it would never happen, but remember, if we were to lose a whole substation, it does happen. That's an immediate cost we have to bear to replace the substation. Depreciation is not used for payroll or administrative costs. It's strictly a capital and equipment item. Other than being statutorily required in terms of why it matters, electricity is vital to life. And I know that sounds simple, but the major loss of a substation could render large portions of the community without power for weeks or months. And while depreciation pays for some routine capital, which is a process we'd like to eventually move away from, we need a sufficient fund balance to ensure equipment is always working and available, and we can always take care of immediate plant needs. And depreciation is also what pays for a lot of the work either during or after a storm, on our ability to be able to respond quickly to a storm, not just to get the power back on, but to make sure we fixed after the fact what's happened in a storm. So the light department maintains what's known as a rate shock fund. We sometimes call it rate stabilization, but it's really better termed the rate shock fund. And it's designed to be utilized in the event of a shock to rates whereby there's a large increase would end up causing a huge increase in the customer or possibly cause the customers to be unable to pay and might cause widespread default on residential and commercial customers. It's a concern not only because we want residents and commercial customers not to be able to, we don't want them to not be able to pay their bills, but the town itself has to make its monthly power purchase for the whole community to have power. And the rate shock fund acts as a backup for that as well. So as I said, our monthly electric costs average about $4 million a month, and a substantial price shock could come from a catastrophic supplier loss. So remember that at the end of the day, we purchase power from actual power plants that are out there. One of those power plants could go down. We never would have thought we would have lost a hospital due to a storm, but an entire power plant can go down. That can cause a substantial shock in rates. You could have other widespread, I'm going to move my screen here, other widespread power loss issues that could cause a catastrophic loss to the community. If we were to have a 50% rate increase because of a huge loss in power, and remember, some of this is market driven, a certain portion of our portfolio, like any energy utility, does have energy from diesel generators throughout the country. Price of oil goes up, it can have an impact on it. A dam could collapse. And if we were to absorb, let's say, a 50% rate increase for 6 months, would require a minimum of $12 million to absorb a 25% increase projected to last a year due to a catastrophic loss would be around the same $12 million. We currently have about $4.7 million in rate shock. It has been increasing and we're doing well, but we do need a concerted effort over many years to get rate shock up to the point where we could actually use it to offset a substantial rate impact that would cause further problems for the utility. If you think of a 50% rate increase, not only are you thinking of the average resident who couldn't absorb their budget their electric bill going up 50%. We have certain commercial customers where their bill is $100,000 or $200,000 per month, and a 50% rate increase for even a 6 or 7 month period until prices came back down would be absolutely catastrophic for a client like that. One of the other items we're going to talk about, or we are talking about, is an operating account or the lack thereof. Currently, the light department doesn't operate with any cash on hand or an operating account. We're the only light department in Massachusetts that does not do this. And it was cited in last year's, or it might be 2 years ago at this point, S&P's credit downgrade. It's an important accounting practice as well. The town still runs everything off one general fund, which has its benefits, but in terms of looking at the light department solely as a business entity, has a substantial negative impact on the light department. We do want to be able to work towards building an operating account balance so that we can operate light department funds and expenses without the need to utilize other funds for cash flow, although the reality is it's usually the other way around. We want to make sure we're eliminating cross subsidies, including hidden cross subsidies to and from the general fund, and also overall improve the overall financial performance of the light department. Developing our operating account to a level of 2 or 3 months worth of bills will take several years, if not longer, but we'll also ensure that we never run the risk of defaulting on our own light bill. If we were to not pay our light bill, and that's the bill that the town, or should say the light department, pays to our suppliers every month, and even being late in those bills, if we were to be late a couple of weeks, would end up triggering us to hold a lot more money with ISO, which is who manages the grid in New England. We need to keep about $10 million on account if we did. We currently only have to keep a couple $1 million on account. So if you ask me, I would much rather keep that extra $6 or $7 million in one of our accounts than handing it over to ISO to manage and play with as they see fit. The light department bond payoff in a couple of years is going to be the #1 trigger that will allow us to start to put the light department in a better position, as well as possibly changing the fixed bill charge in the next couple of years. I want to talk for a minute about purchase power, because this is a big item that everyone sees in the budget and they often have questions about. Purchase power refers to the budgetary line in the NLB budget reserved for purchasing our monthly power needs. That number is at best a guess, and it's based on historic usage. Higher purchase power number does not necessarily mean that we're going to purchase that power, and does not necessarily translate into higher rates, nor does it mean that we're committed to buying that number. We could put in the budget next year that we're going to put purchase power is going to be $500 million. We're probably only going to purchase $45 million worth of power. And it's not like we buy it and then hold on to it. On the other hand, a lower purchase power budget line does not necessarily translate to lower rates. You have to sort of divorce the two of those in your mind. I know some folks like to look at the purchase power rate and say, oh, it went up, so my rates are going up, or oh, it went down, so my rates are getting down. I want to make sure everyone in their mind divorces those two numbers. Purchase power is adjusted by the volume of power purchased as well as the cost of power purchased. But a new customer coming to town that has $1 million annual bill would see purchase power increase by $1 million, but that would actually have a downward impact on rates, because the light plant is generating more revenue overall. So that purchase power number goes up because, yes, we're buying an additional $1 million worth of power, but we're selling an additional $1 million worth of power as well. The Boston Skating Club is an example. They came on board about 6 months ago. Their electric bill's around $40,000 a month. So that's an example of where that would cause purchase power to go up $500,000, but that doesn't mean that we're raising people's rates by $500,000. Conversely, they go out of town, we lose that amount of money, purchase power goes down that amount. We're not selling as much power, but we're not buying as much power as either. So as the cost of power goes up, generally the rates go up as well. As the volume goes up, the rates can generally have it's sort of a depressive attitude or depressive impact on the rates if the volume goes up. Realistically, the volume doesn't go up generally so much in 1 year that everyone says, oh, great, the volume went up 60%, so our rates are going to go down 30%. Usually don't see that much, but the more volume that people are using, the better it is for everyone overall, because our additional cost to service, for instance, the Boston Skating Club, or Moderna helped out when they came on a few years ago, our additional cost to service that account is really minimal. It's built into sort of our fixed cost. So we always want more clients, but we also have 100% of the business in town. I'm going to go through rate setting very, very briefly, only because it's incredibly complicated. In brief, you determine the total revenue amounts of what the NLD requires. You determine the cost of service by class. You allocate it according to class. You then factor in your programmatic or your policy decisions. That being said, that's very limited in Massachusetts. One of the questions we occasionally get is, can we give someone a discount on power? Can we give the schools a discount on power? Can we give small businesses a discount on power? Can we give these people a discount on power? In Massachusetts, we are not allowed by DPU regulations to sell power for less than our costs. So we're not able to do that. We don't have what's known as sort of economic development rates. Some places you go in the South and the West, they do it where they run their own utility. They want to introduce or they want to induce a big company to move there, and they give them a great rate on their electricity for either in perpetuity or just to incentivize them to come there. We're not able to do that. I had a company in town that called me about a year ago and said, we're paying about 14 cents a kilowatt per hour, and we've got plants down in the Carolinas that are paying 4 cents an hour for power. And I said, if you're paying 4 cents an hour for power at those plants down there, you should consider moving down there, because we're not even buying it for 4 cents of power to raw cost. So we're not able to sell below our cost. This chart here just shows basically how we go about doing a cost of service study, which determines what the rates end up being. I know everyone always says, how do you figure out our rates? We functionalize and take our total costs. We try to break it out into what's demand related, what's energy related, and then what's customer related, and then try to break it up between residential, the commercial rates, and the large industrial rates to make sure that each ratepayer is actually paying their fair share of what the overall rates and cost of electricity are. There is a danger in avoiding rate setting just to avoid rate setting. Each year rate increases avoided, the compounded loss to NLD over the following decade is substantial. And what I mean by that is if we were to raise rates by 1%, that's about $450,000 in revenue to the light department, give or take. However, when we choose not to raise that rate, we're losing out on the ability to collect that money each year that we didn't raise those rates. So over the course of 10 years, having not gone up that 1 percentage point ends up being about a $4 million loss to the light department. So when we look at, we don't have more money in the bank, we don't have more money for capital, that's where it's sort of going. That money either bleeds from available fund balances or it reduces our operational funds. And there's a small typo there. Now, in July 2018, I actually think it was 2016, we raised rates about 8%. And had we gone for smaller annual increases in those previous years, the rate increase would have averaged out to be about 6%. So delaying rate increases when costs are rising will always cost our customers more in the long run. Now, it's a catch-22 because we always look at the budget and we never want to raise rates unless we have to. But by just saying, no, we don't want to do it, just absorb it somewhere, all that's doing is kicking that can down the road and leading to a bigger rate increase and a bigger spike down the road with electricity. And just to reiterate here, we cannot set rates below the cost of power, including our cost. It's a DPU regulation. It's allowed elsewhere. We can't do it. We have tried to play every game around that rule, but unfortunately, there's no way to actually go about doing that. So I think as everyone on the FinCom knows, the credit rating is important. The light department's credit rating, which is tied to the town but gets analyzed as its own credit entity, was downgraded about 2 years ago. Among S&P's concerns at the time was the high level of overall turnover to the town. Remember that the light department turns its statutory excess over to the town. That's that 8% of plant. Very good for the town and very good for the residents overall. Taking a step aside and looking at the light department as a business entity, it's a very large turnover, similar to a company giving a very high dividend because they're liquidating assets or something like that. We don't have any cash on hand or operating account for the light department. There's an overall high debt level to revenue. That will change after the light department bond is paid off. Technically, the light department has negative equity. The large bond that we have for the rate settlement from 20 years ago doesn't positively impact plant value. And there is concern over delaying rate increases when needed. They certainly understand there's a political calculation there as well, but they're always concerned when they don't see us raising rates when they think that we should be. As I said, the light department has its own credit rating and it can impact both rates. As I said, our credit rating can also impact what we have to put down on contracts and sometimes the rate we can get for contracts as well. So there's an additional benefit to the light department having a positive credit rating. In addition, it is tied to the town. The town, and I'm sure the FinCom's aware of this, but we'll always have money borrowed for infrastructure, and credit rating will always impact electric rates, broadband rates, water rates, sewer rates, and tax rates for decades to come. So that's why eventually moving towards better credit profiles is good, but we have to take that in the context of we want to get there, but I don't think it's easy to go to the ratepayers and say, well, we're going to raise your rates 10% this year just because we want a better credit rating to save you 2% in 6 or 7 years. But we always want to be making progress, and the light department's made some good progress. So in FY24, the light department bond will be paid off. This is a large bond for the rate settlement from about 20 years ago. And it's critical now. The light department's going to want to begin their capital planning and begin aligning what the light department is doing to look at things like market changes, look at new projects, and begin planning now. So that way, all of a sudden, it's not just, oh, we haven't planned. Oh, great, there's this gap in the budget. What do we want to do with it? We need to start planning out ahead of time. So the draft plan as it is, I'm going to move these down so I can move this over. The number across the top screen is the total amount of debt reduction. You'll notice that between FY24 and FY25, it actually goes up. The bond comes off in 2 separate payments. So, and these are rough numbers. There'll be about $4 million available in FY24, and then it's 4.8, and then it goes down each subsequent year as the budget is absorbing part of that, part of those savings. So you'll see in year 1, which is FY24, the proposal would be about $500,000 allocated to rate relief. And what that just means is the first $500,000 of cost increases would be absorbed in the general light department budget by this additional money available in the budget. So that way we're starting to hopefully depress rates or at least slow the growth of rate increases. We would transfer about $2.5 million to rate shock, about $1 million to an operating account. You'll notice in each of the subsequent fiscal years, we have a plan to how we're going to work on this bond payment. The plan being that by FY30, we'll have done about $4 million into rate relief, about $9 million. So that's about $4 million of consumer rate relief, to be clear. About $9 million going to the rate shock fund, about $3.5 million into an operating account. And then we do want to begin budgeting for some capital. Years ago, the light department did actually budget for some of its operating capital, vehicles and other items. While you can take them out of depreciation, we do want to look at building depreciation up, not only to maintain a higher fund balance overall for the town and the light department, but also to make sure it's available there for larger emergencies and larger capital projects. As we said, it's important to plan now for fiscal changes when the large NLD bond is paid off. It'll allow us to bring rate shock to an acceptable level, build our cash on hand fund, finally have budgeted capital expenses, and provide almost $4 million in rate relief to our customers over a 7-year period. Planning is essential to these financial targets, and the financial health of the electric utility needs to be a top priority. There is no business with weak financials that can ultimately deliver consistent, reliable, safe, and cost-effective solution to its customers. There's a lot of challenges and opportunities coming in the electric industry in the next decade or so. Distributed energy, climate change related grid impacts, an increase in storm events. Regulations on green energy will be good for the environment and bad for our pocketbook. Battery storage, the electrification of transport, and a few other items. So the next 10 years or so, we're going to see some incredible change and complexity in the electric industry. There's going to be quite a lot of disruption. So planning now to be in a good financial position will help us head those disruptive changes on, take on those changes head on. And that is all I have. Tom wants to take the script. Emily wants to, I'll stop sharing my screen. And we've got some time. I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has.
I think Kelly has a question.
I do. My first question is turning off my mute. My second question is, so this is all excellent, Tony. I love all of this, to prepare for this stuff so we don't have any unexpected surprises. So could you explain, how would this impact the operating budget? It seems like it's all coming from a reduction in debt savings from the last, second to last slide you said. So would this have zero impact on the operating budget, or would this increase the operating budget by the amount of the debt reductions?
So you're taking some of that debt payment, and it's going to, where you saw that capital item, that's going to go into the operating budget. What you'll see in the operating budget is transfer to this account, transfer to this account, just like you see in the general government budget. You see transfer to stabilization every year. You'll actually see a line in there, transfer to cash on hand, transfer to stabilization in the light department budget. So the net impact will be zero, although that rate relief is where you're going to see as costs go up. There's a $4 million savings in the budget. Well, it's only $3.5 million in the budget, and it slowly gets smaller and smaller.
So it grows the budget, but it's not money we touch. It just inflates the budget by the amount we're now putting into these efforts.
Correct. It's just moving it over from debt service to the operating budget.
Got it. So it goes in operating budget. It comes out of debt service. So the operating budget goes up. Not that we could touch the money. I get it. I get what it's for, but it will increase our operating budget. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Any other questions before we move from anyone? All right. And we're still 2 fiscal years away from planning for these changes.
Correct. So as we all know, the best plans end up meeting with reality, and they end up getting completely thrown out of the thrown out of the window, but that's sort of the tentative goal and the direction we'd like to go in down the road when we get there.
And Haley.
Can we get a copy of your presentation, please, just so we can digest it a little better?
Sure, I can send it out. Make a note of that.
It's sometimes hard to look back at things because we have presentations and we don't necessarily get a copy of the presentation, so that if you want to go back and look something up, it's difficult.
Sure.
So thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, if there are no further questions, Tony, thank you very much for the presentation. I know you need to get off to the storm. What are we looking at for snow, Tony?
It could be good. It could only be 4 or 5 inches. It could be a foot. And just to remind everyone, our COVID numbers are up and they're continuing to go up. So that adds a layer of complexity to everything that we're doing.
Thank you very much, Tony. So with that, we'll let Tony go to his meeting and we'll move on to the next item. Mr. Fraser, Peter Fraser, good evening, and thank you for attending, as well as to Lisa Driscoll. And our apologies for delaying your timing for your presentation.
Oh, no problem whatsoever. Thanks for having me, and good evening, everybody. Mark Good was kind enough to invite Lisa and me to speak with you and kind of reprise the presentation we did a little over a year ago. Basically, in connection with your bond rating and recent borrowing, the good news, as you've probably heard, is the town most recently renewed about $12.3 million in bond anticipation notes for a year, and this is for your ongoing, land acquisition project. And just to show you how astonishingly low interest rates are, you received a net rate of 0.31% for this 1 year bond anticipation note. And on top of it, it's a taxable note. Ordinarily, when you borrow for public purposes, you can borrow on a tax exempt basis, meaning that the investor that you're paying interest to doesn't have to declare that income on their taxes, which typically means that they'll accept a lower rate of interest. And the fact that these are taxable, meaning that the investor who bought this will have to pay taxes on this 0.31% that they're going to receive, is just astonishing, and obviously very good news for the town. But what I should probably start by asking, how much time have you allotted for this part of your evening? I know you've got a full schedule, and I don't want to take more of it than is programmed.
I think you're fine. I think there's really only a couple of other items on the agenda. We have some presentation on the airport financial, which would probably be maybe a 20 to 30 minute discussion and a capital outlay discussion. So why don't you just take your time? I'm thinking that it is now 5:09. If we can anticipate that by 5:45, perhaps we get through the agenda.
Okay.
How's that? And then we'll reassess.
Yep. And just start waving your hands or put your head down or something to give me a signal if I'm droning on too long. But what I'm hoping we can do, we've sort of got it divided up into 3 pieces. One is an overview of the credit rating process. And then my colleague of almost 20 years, Lisa Driscoll, will touch on some comparative information that she's put together or updated for you versus the AAA rated credits in Massachusetts. Just see sort of how some of your neighbors are doing. And then the final piece is just to show you your most recent rating report, which we won't go through in detail, but just know that that's a reference there for you if you haven't seen it before. So if we can start out with the credit rating overview. And Mark, are you willing to, or is it Tom that's got the controls? If you can just help me by scrolling through as we go, that would be a big help. So in any case, the first place for folks that sort of haven't seen this presentation before, just sort of what is a credit rating. And basically it's an opinion as to the credit. I think we're on the next one, Tom. Thanks. It's opinion as to the creditworthiness of a particular issue. It's used by market participants to determine the prices of securities, meaning when you issue bonds, they're all fixed rate, meaning that an interest rate or interest rates are assigned to that bond on the day of sale and are fixed over the life of the issue. And this is a shorthand way for the investment community to get a general sense of your creditworthiness versus everybody else out there so that they can make decisions about, well, would they rather invest in a Norwood security or some other communities, bonds or notes anywhere in the country. And they're paid for by you, but they're really, when you think about who it's intended for, it's intended for the investment community. And again, to give them that comfort that, that they understand what they're getting into when they buy your securities. The next slide shows the bond rating scales for Moody's and Standard & Poor's, which are the two largest or most often used rating agencies, particularly in Massachusetts. Standard & Poor's being the rating agency that the town employs, and is actually the one that does the most business now here in Massachusetts. And you can see those scales are similar in terms of the sort of alphanumerics, a little bit different, but it starts with AAA, that's the highest rating attainable, and essentially communicates to the investor that, this is the strongest credit you can have, and therefore investors are willing to accept a lower rate of return because there's a lower perceived risk associated with those high credits. You guys are just one notch below the highest rating attainable at AA+, and as is the federal government right now, as a matter of fact, is AA+. And the ratings go down from there to the BBB-. Now these are the investment grade scales for municipals. There are ratings below that BBB level, but those would be referred to as non-investment grade or junk bonds. And fortunately in Massachusetts, there are none. So on our next slide, obviously one of the reasons that you get a credit rating is, again, to give comfort to the investors. And depending on the credit rating that you get, you're going to get lower rates if you're a very highly rated, and the lower rated credits, the weaker credits, if you will, are going to receive higher interest rates on their borrowings in the market. And these lines are referred to as yield curves. When you see the little dots there, those represent when you guys go out and do, let's say, a 20-year bond issue. You're not, unlike a home mortgage, which is a single loan, with a bond issue, a 20-year bond issue, you're actually making 20 or receiving 20 individual loans that are aggregated into a single one, but each representing maturing in a different year. So it's sort of a 1-year loan, a 2-year loan, a 3-year loan, and a 4-year loan, and so forth. And each one of them has an interest rate tied to it. And generally speaking, the interest rates on the short end of your loan are going to be lower, and on the long end are going to be higher. And that's typically because investors expect if they're going to tie up their money for a longer term, they're going expect a higher rate of return on it. And the differences between these lines represent the difference in interest rates that you would get by being a particular credit quality. And you can see that the bottom two lines, which represent AAA and AA, are pretty close together. They're both very strong ratings. The higher ones, as you get to a lower credit rating, it's going to cost you more. And it's not that it's referred to as a quality spread. That difference between the rating categories expands as you get weaker in credit, as well as when interest rates rise, the difference between those rates tends to expand as well. Our next slide talks about sort of ballpark, what's the value of a credit rating. It really changes with the general level of interest rates, but to kind of ballpark, one, obviously the value is the higher your rating, the lower your borrowing costs. It's also, there are more investors out there, and it's a supply and demand thing, that are willing to lend money to higher rated credits. And that sort of sounds Captain Obvious stuff, but which contributes to the fact that because there's more demand, there's lower borrowing costs. The quality spreads, as I referred to before, is basically that interest rate or dollar impact on if you get downgraded. And so what just sort of ballparking, if you had a $10 million 20-year issue, the difference between a AAA rated security and a AA rated security is the AAA would save about $228,000 over the life of that loan. If you drop from AAA to single A, the additional cost would be about $1.4 million, $1.5 million. And if you were AAA and dropped to BBB, it's about $3.3 million. So the point being, obviously, one of the reasons we strive for the highest rating attainable is there's a real cost difference in terms of borrowing. The other value of it is the rating is an unbiased expert assessment of the town's creditworthiness or well-being. And so that can also be helpful in terms of providing some sort of advice in terms of, or at least identify areas where the town might be able to improve certain aspects of their credit. Our next slide talks about sort of when the rating agencies look at the community, when they're rating it, they break down the myriad of factors into four basic categories. One is the economy and institutional framework, and that's weighted with about 40% of the score that goes into the rating. Management is about 20%, finances about 30%, and debt and contingent liabilities. And those contingent liabilities are your pension and OPEB liabilities, is about 10% of the overall score that gets determined. And institutional framework isn't obvious. It's essentially, depending on what state you're in, there's a different sort of set of aspects with respect to how a community can raise revenue. There's certain communities like Massachusetts that have revenue restrictions, Proposition 2.5. There are others that have no restrictions on the ability of a community to raise additional revenue. So that sort of gets factored in. There's a little bit more to that, but why don't we keep moving to the next slide. In terms of the things that, with respect to where the economy breaks down, not only are they looking at the national, regional, global, and local economies, but they're also looking at things like, what's the composition of your tax base? Is it growing? How big is it? What's the employment picture, or conversely, the unemployment rate? things like your wealth and income, whether it's per capita income, median family income, average home value, that sort of thing, as well as economic activity in terms of building permits, what the largest taxpayer portfolio looks like, and whether folks are moving in, moving out. I mentioned the institutional framework, so that gives you that first broad category. With respect to management, we're not talking about just folks' resumes or experience. What one of the key things that they key on is what kind of policies and practices framework is the town working under. And this is 20% of your score. So they're looking at things like, do you have capital budgets? Do you have operating forecasts? Do you do budget versus actual? How frequently do decision makers look at those types of reports? Do you have policies with respect to reserves? We're going to maintain, in your case, there's a 5% policy in terms of fund balance. With respect to debt, they might be looking at, how long do you amortize your debt for? What portion of your budget is going to be, are you going to limit in terms of debt service? With respect to investments, are you collateralizing your investments? There are any number of things, but the idea being that the thinking being that managers come and go, but one of the things that's really important for the rating agencies is to be able to understand that framework, to understand whether there's continuity and stability. The next factor would be debt. I think did we miss finances there, Tom? Or are my slides out of, yeah, if we can just, I think one more up. Okay, finances comprise 30% of the score, and the idea being, it breaks down into budgetary flexibility. This is sort of the absolute amount of reserves that you have. Think about it as your financial cushion. They're looking at it, fundamentally unassigned general fund balance and stabilization funds, because those are the dollars that are available to meet unforeseen circumstances. And remember, the rating agencies are really thinking about the bondholder. And if things get tough in Norwood, what's the likelihood that the bondholders are going to get paid? So that's the focus on budgetary flexibility. Budgetary performance is more about how consistent are you generating surpluses? Or, is that sort of an every year thing that's reliable, or is there volatility with respect to, you have a good year and then a bad year and a good year and a bad year? So they look at that. And in terms of budgetary performance, one of the things that's a little bit, I think I could argue with the rating agencies about is, you don't get the top score unless your surpluses are growing at least 5% a year. But when you think about it, if you have really ample surpluses, it'd be silly to keep growing them at 5% forever. So one of the things you'll see in your report that they don't rate you as highly, even though you do have adequate reserves, is the fact that they're not growing forever. They're also looking for structural balance, meaning that your revenues, your recurring revenues are at least equal to your recurring expenditures, so that you're not drawing down on fund balance to pay for operations, because eventually if you continued that for any period of time, your reserve position would deteriorate and disappear. And finally, in terms of finances, they look at your liquidity, which is essentially your cash position. The next slide is just sort of highlighting why reserves are important, and that's, it is that measure of financial flexibility. It gives you resources to meet unforeseen expenses. It helps stabilize your employment and your service delivery. If you've got that financial cushion and there's a bad time, that you've got that to draw on in the event. And it also generates interest income and contributes to that enhanced market access, and meaning that the more generous your reserve position, the more likely folks will be to lend to you. Our fourth category is that debt and contingent liability, and the kind of things that they look at with respect to debt is your actual as well as your prospective debt. So one of the things that ties into sort of the finance picture is that capital improvement plan that identifies future capital needs and sources of funds to fund that capital, including debt. With respect to debt, they also will tease out, okay, well, do you have debt that's exempt from Prop 2.5? Because that essentially has a additional revenue source, if you will, that isn't putting pressure on the operating budget within the levy limit. Do you have enterprise supported debt? Same reason you have flexibility in terms of revenue raising to support that. And then finally, looking at your tax supported debt within the levy limit. You guys do have some unused levy capacity, but there are a lot of communities in Massachusetts that don't. And so being up against that levy limit, adding new debt means that you may have to take away something from some other operating budget line item to accommodate it. They look at the amortization, and that's meaning the way the debt is structured over time. Typically, shorter amortization has a slight advantage from a credit standpoint over longer amortization, but even at 30 years for larger projects for the town of Norwood would not be seen negatively, although they do have a metric that says if you're amortizing 65% or more of your outstanding principal within 10 years, you get the highest sort of score you can on that metric. They also look at offsetting aid payments or subsidies, whether it's MSBA type of subsidies, Mass School Building Authority subsidies, or library grants that are coming in against capital projects, or in the case of your debt that's funded by Eversource, obviously they would take that into account as well. And finally, the contingent liabilities, your unfunded pension and OPEB liabilities, these for many communities are very large numbers as well, and you're obligated to service them, not quite the same way as debt, but it's an important thing that they look at. The good news for Norwood is obviously your pension liability is scheduled to be paid off by 2029. The funding is somewhere in the $4+ million per year now, and tops out at something like $5.5, $6 million in 2029. And not to wear you out with details, but the thing that's important about that is the incremental increase from one year to the next isn't that onerous for Norwood in comparison to many communities, and you guys being about 80% funded is also very favorable compared to your peers, which there are a lot of credits in Massachusetts that their pension might only be 50% funded. OPEB liabilities, that's a little bit of a squishier number, simply because pension is very formulaic in terms of what those costs are going to be in the future. whereas OPEB is a softer number based on any number of things, including medical cost inflation, which is a little bit difficult to predict. But the long and the short of it, it's a big number. Your liability somewhere in the $90 million, I think, range, but it doesn't have a set schedule like the pension. So anyway, that's something that you do contribute to, but if there's a relative weak point, I think the rating agencies would point to that OPEB liability and the need for stronger funding. So in terms of, I just took these highlights out of the most recent rating report. And as you can see, they're all very strong economy, strong management with good financial policies and practices. That's great news. That adequate budgetary performance with slight operating surpluses, that's kind of what I was referring to before. Just because it's not meeting that 5% increase number, it comes in only as adequate, but I think we could argue that point. However, you do have strong budgetary flexibility, so that the rating agencies are recognizing that, generally speaking, you do keep a decent level of operating reserves and unassigned fund balance and stabilization, and you have very strong liquidity, and they have you a strong debt and contingent liability profile. So that kind of, in a nutshell, gets you to the end of mine. What I was hoping to do, unless we can entertain questions now or wait till the end, is let Lisa give you a quick overview of the credit rating comparison.
Sure. I think perhaps right now we should just open it up for questions, and they can move into Lisa's presentation.
Sure, of course.
Just the one question I had as you were going through your presentation is you talked about the major credit factors, budgetary performance and budget flexibility, and we heard earlier the presentation from Tony regarding the Light Department and the anticipated changes that there in the financial structures. How significant is the Light Department history to our credit, to the overall town credit rating?
Sure. As he mentioned, the way you folks have your system set up is it's not a standalone enterprise, where most electric light departments are their own sort of business, and the surpluses within the fund stay within that fund, except for things like pilot payments, which can be substantial, where a community will transfer every year in the form of a payment in lieu of taxes type of payment to the community. But the one thing that I heard that I think I would modify is that the reason that the Norwood Light Department gets a credit rating, a standalone credit rating, is because of that's a requirement of power purchase contracts. It isn't that you guys borrow. The Light Department doesn't borrow. The town borrows for the Light Department and transfers the borrowed funds to the Light Department to use. So the rating that impacts your borrowing costs is the town's rating. And it's, as I say, it's very strong, one notch down from AAA. So it's still important that the Light Department's rating be strong, because that's a requirement for the power purchase providers. They have to look at the credit worthiness on sort of a standalone basis, which kind of never made sense to me. But they look at that and either factor that into their pricing, or it's a pass-fail type of thing that if you've got a high enough rating, on a standalone basis, then they can sell you power at whatever rate.
Any other observations or questions before we move into the next? Alan? Then Ann. Okay, Alan, please. Go ahead, Alan.
Thank you, Bob. And again, I'd like to thank Peter Frazier. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I have one question. It relates to tax supported debt as it relates to the percentage of the town's operating budget. I've heard some people claim that that should be a relatively high number, you know, that sort of because it would show people that the town supports its infrastructure. I've never really, you know, understood that logic at all. And, you know, to me, there are certain times where maybe you should pay, you know, using bonding. The other times you should pay for certain infrastructure with cash. So I wonder if you could sort of expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I've been doing this for 35 years, and I'm not sure I understand the logic of somebody that says, well, we've got to keep our debt high. I do think there's some, and I certainly understand an argument for some sort of stability, if you can, when you're borrowing money for things that are tax supported within the levy limit. If you don't keep it at a sort of the same level, what ends up happening is the debt rolls off, the capacity that's generated typically then gets diverted to non-capital items in a lot of communities. And then it's very difficult to recapture that to pay for things. So what a lot of communities do is they say, well, let's not think of capital as just debt service. Let's think of it as a budget item that maybe grows incrementally like the operating budget. And we can sort of toggle back and forth. If our debt is rolling off, we can use, you know, we can buy police cruisers without borrowing for them, for instance. You know, so the point there is just reinvesting in capital is an important thing for communities, but it's sort of how to manage that expense so that it doesn't create shocks to the system. But the other side of it is, for most communities, they're not big enough to really have a very stable profile in terms of their debt, because a school project only comes down the pike once every 10, 15 years, and that's going to create a spike. And in those instances, it's the kind of thing that's when you maybe try to exclude it from Proposition 2.5.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I believe Ann had her hand up. You're muted, Ann.
Okay, let's start again. Sorry. Listen, we've gone through this a couple of times. We had you here last year, and I thank you very much for coming back. But OPEB seems to be a sticking point that in the reports that we received, the ratings last year and this year, it seemed to have been an issue, not a large issue, but an issue, and it's rearing its ugly head again. Have you? I think when we did the policies, we asked you to look at the policies last year after we finished them and to review them. I'm wondering if you could take a look at our OPEB policy and see if there's something in there that's sticking out that we need to maybe change to help us find the right level of, how shall we say it? It is not interfering with our ratings, I guess.
Sure, be happy to.
Yeah, I as you were talking, I actually, before you came, I took a look at it just to, yeah. I think it could possibly be simplified and also be a little bit more direct, I guess, in how we're supposed to be putting in our funds. And maybe that's part of our problem, is that we've got some wishy-washy stuff in there. So I would appreciate that if you could.
Sure, happy to.
Yeah.
You know,
And my other question, if you don't mind, Bob, when you came to see us last year, I think you were discussing the ratings that we got for June 12th of 2019.
Okay.
And I don't know that we've had anything in between. I'm assuming we didn't. I don't know. But then,
Oh, I was just going to say, we just received a rating report. It is dated November 23rd, and this was in connection with your rollover of notes for the land acquisition project.
correct. Yes.
So that, and that's actually included here. And, you know, if Mark has it on his computer, or Tom does, and so it's available for anyone that would like to look at it.
We actually received it. And so I was looking at both of them sort of side by side. They're significantly different. And one thing that I noticed on the front page of the reports, one report says rationale, outlook, and related, table of contents. The older one says rationale, outlook, and related research. And the newer one says rating, action, stable outlook, credit, opinion, and related research. Is there a reason why the table of contents is different in each one?
The format may be a little bit different. One is a note rating, one's a bond rating. So
Okay.
there may be a little bit of formatting difference, but the fundamental information that's in there is the same stuff. It's just, you know, and the presentation evolves over time in terms of the rating agencies. They, you know, they refine things in terms of the way they're going to present it. But the information itself is, they're looking at all the same data points.
Okay. One more comment, Bob, please.
Sure.
The most recent one seems a little more harsh in our looking to add more funds to our different, more money to our different funds. Even though they say strong liquidity and they say all of the good stuff, but they are more focused, I thought, in this issue than in the one in 2019. I just couldn't quite figure out why there was more of a negative.
That's a really good observation. And I think in part it's because of COVID that some of the headwinds associated with COVID and sort of some of these macroeconomic changes associated, or at least that are possible, are being factored into some of their language, where they're sort of less optimistic, if you will. Not so much in terms of what you guys are doing, but just that the environment is changing somewhat, and there's more uncertainty than there was perhaps a year and a half ago.
Okay. All right. I mean, in general, it's nothing we're doing.
No, I really don't think so. You know, but it is, we're all living in that world, and if it's sort of a harsher place, I think they're thinking maybe communities got to do a little bit more than they have in the past to insulate themselves from the possible sort of adverse events.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So just one observation, just that building on Ann's earlier comments, in terms of our financial policies in our comparatively weaker areas in terms of our OPED funding. I mean, you know, we do have, and this is something I've talked to Tony about, you know, we do have a very good free cash number this past certification. You know, in general, it's in excess of 6 million. And our policies do have a stipulation that when we have free cash above and beyond $5 million, that excess really should be going into OPED, pension, and reserves. So it's just a data point I think we should keep in mind as we go forward into our planning for FY22, that you know, that use of free cash to help firm up or to give funding above and beyond to those areas is we have the opportunity this year. Peter, I was wondering, does anyone else have any questions? I had one more. Judy?
Bob, I do.
Tom, we'll have Judy, then Tom.
Thank you, Bob. Yep.
All right, Judy, you're on. You're on mute, Judy.
Am I off now?
You are.
Peter, thank you very much. Every time you come, we pick up something new and obviously more questions. I'm interested in the retirement, Norwood's entire retirement, and how we were 84.4 in fiscal 18, and now we're down to 777. Additionally, we, in the projections ahead, we use 7.75 discount rate. Is it correct the state is only using 7.50 and that may have got them into a 2040 full payment?
Yeah, and the idea for those that aren't familiar with the way that works is the pension funding gets reevaluated every couple of years based on what the actual performance of the assets in the pension fund are, as well as any changes to plan benefits. So that if all of a sudden there's some increase in plan benefits and there isn't a offsetting increase in the funds that are being contributed, obviously your funding ratio is going to go down. And conversely, or if your assets don't perform at the assumed rate of return that's built into the sort of model, you're also going to see instances where the unfunded liability goes up. If you change your assumption to say, well, geez, we were at 775 and now we're at 7.25, everything else being equal, that means your unfunded liability will get larger and you'll have to put in more in the subsequent years in order to be fully funded in the same period of time. So you've got a lot of moving parts to that. And as you know, every 2 years you have to get it reevaluated and come up with a new schedule that PERAC approves. You also have some flexibility with respect to the length of that funding schedule. The good news for you folks is that you're only out to 2029, as opposed to some communities are out to 2040. So the thinking being, if you can afford to make those payments and stay on that schedule in 2030, you're going to have $6 million of appropriation available for other purposes, maybe for OPEB funding or for something else. But again, those numbers aren't set in stone. It really just depends on those other factors in terms of performance that are going to determine whether you make it there on this schedule.
So really the decrease from 84.4 down to 77 is not a big negative for us, correct, in the rating?
Well, it certainly doesn't, it's not helpful, but the other thing, because, what you want to do is be fully funded. And
Sure.
the more fully funded, the better from a credit rating standpoint. But the other thing that you should know is the rating agencies, when they look at your profile, will look at your underlying assumptions. So if you had a wildly optimistic assumption, geez, we're going to return 10% on our assets every year, that'd mean you'd have a pretty small, relatively small unfunded liability and need to make relatively small payments to get there. But what they'll do is they'll say, well, that's unrealistic. We think, the baseline should be 4.5% for their purposes, and they'll recalculate based on that. So the idea is For most communities, they've been bringing down their actuarial assumption in terms of rate of return, which is increasing their liability and increasing the amount of money that they have to make in payments. But know that regardless of what you do, the rating agencies are going to overlay a sort of their metrics or standards on that and recalculate. Because when you think about it, you have all these pension systems all over the country that are using a different set of assumptions. So they have to sort of normalize it in order to compare you against some other system. Does that
Okay,
make
thank you.
sense?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Tom Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Peter, thanks for the presentation. It's really good. I'm sitting in my car, by the way, so I hope I'm coming through okay.
Yep.
Just a couple of things. I have the S&P reports going back to 2015, and in the 6 metrics that you mentioned, Norwood has rated exactly the same year after year in all of them, 5 out of the 6. The only one where we've seen variation is in debt profile, where 2015 we were very strong and we fell to strong and we fell to adequate, and now we're back up to strong. So there is a certain amount of consistency in what we're doing here. What I take from you today, between you and the presentation from last week with Victor, one, Victor said it's a lot harder to get to AAA for a municipality today than it was a long time ago. Is that an accurate portrayal of what he said?
Yes, it is. And you know, I had talked about the headwinds relative to COVID. You guys could be doing absolutely everything right, and they could say, you know, now's not the time. There's too much uncertainty in the market. So you kind of got to factor that into your expectations in terms of, well, if we do, you know, X, Y, and Z, is that going to give us a AAA? Not necessarily, because they have these sort of intangibles or the things that are outside of your control that will impact the rating. And right now the tone is pretty negative given the uncertainties associated with the pandemic and the economic fallout.
Well, that's fair to say. What I heard, what we're hearing in all these presentations is the more you have in reserves, the better it is in terms of rating. And what you said today that was interesting was it's kind of like, you know, looking at as a dividend investor. You're not only looking at the company's dividend, you're also looking to see a history of growth. And you said the same thing about reserves, which is they want to see that you have a healthy percentage in reserve. They also want to see that you're growing it consistently. And that's got to be a sort of a value decision that the town has to make, whether or not you want to, you know, increase taxes and continue to make cuts for the sake of growing your reserves, even after you have a healthy base. But I thought that was an interesting point. Finally, with reference to OPEB, Peter, I think, you know, you're right on, and I wouldn't say it's a matter of rearing its ugly head, although I get Ann's point about it, that it's always there, but it's always there. I mean, the OPEB thing is going to be there for a long time. So just have a policy about funding it. Try to increase the funding steadily as she goes. Try to get closer and closer to 100% funding of it, and do the best you can. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah. You know, there were a couple of things there in terms of part of the reason that they want to see reserves growing consistently is because they look at it as reserves as a percent of revenues or as reserves as a percent of expenditures, and that's growing every year. So if you're not growing your, at least on a consistent over time basis, your reserves, that percentage is going to keep dropping. So that's part of that. The flip side of that argument, though, is if you are very well reserved, I think it, for me, takes some of the pressure out of that need to grow at a sort of furious pace, because, you know, if all you're doing is doing it to get to that next level in terms of your credit rating, one of the things I would point to is, you know, the difference between the interest rate that you guys got as a AA plus and what a AAA would have gotten on that most recent borrowing is almost nothing. And part of that is because interest rates are so low and those credit spreads are so compressed right now, where sometimes where rates return to more normal, there might be some sort of qualitative difference. But the question is how much are you going to want to devote to reserves to get that incremental benefit in terms of the interest rate? And I'm not trying to talk you out of it by any means, but there is, you sort of got to keep a certain perspective with respect to, why are we doing what we're doing?
Well, that's an excellent point, and I agree with you. The OPEB thing, I have to once again applaud my former colleague. When I was on the FinCom, it was Judy Langone who kind of put it on our radar about 7 years ago, and we set up the trust fund and did some initial funding and established some policies for certain excesses to go into that fund as well. But I mean, we'll make the progress that we make over time, and we'll do the best we can. By the way, you probably said this, Peter, and this is my last question. Is there a year in which we're expected to be fully funded on OPEB just as we are on pension?
To my knowledge, there isn't a fixed schedule that you have, although you may have an actuary that's generated that. For a lot of communities, it's literally like a rolling 30-year amortization in terms of their assumptions. For some communities, there's no schedule at all. And in fact, they're not coming anywhere near, unlike your pension, where if you stick with the current schedule and you meet your investment assumptions, you're going to be done. Here, the amount that's being contributed to OPEB isn't sufficient to cover, to make any progress in terms of forward progress on that. And I think for a lot of communities, what it is, we're making sort of token amounts until, let's say, your pension's paid off. Then you can start contributing sufficient amounts to actually start making some progress about amortizing that liability.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Bob Donnelly, for the invitation. I appreciate this. This is a great meeting. Thank you.
All right. I see David has his hand up. David.
Thank you, Bob. Hi, Peter. David Ajar. So,
Hi, David.
Tom touched on something, and I know you're going to go through the S&P report, but just as a pretext, I don't look at the town of Norwood as attaining a AAA rating in 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. I'm not putting a timeline on that. I know that is a potential goal, but the goal needs to have a plan behind it that can identify certain steps we need to take. We talked about this last year, and we talked about it with Victor within the past couple of weeks. And while S&P is not going to get into a specific plan of identifying what the town of Norwood needs to do, I think he sort of referenced you as our advisors, you and Lisa, by saying you guys should be the one that says, okay, if S&P identifies a certain, whether it's just adequate or good, but even in the verbiage that talks about we should strengthen its current management policies and practices, that someone's got to be able to tell us what that means in plain English in what boards can do going forward. And I'm not saying we're going to achieve it in 1 year, but someone needs to tell us how to get there.
Right.
And even given ranges, when they talk stabilization funds and all that, Norwood is doing well. Can it do better? Obviously it can, because we're not a AAA. But if Victor can't tell us what that specific number means for each of these, I would expect you as our advisor to at least give us a range to say, you probably want to be between this number and that number to get a good quality consideration for AAA. And same with any of the other weaknesses that when you go through Victor's report, there are several weaknesses that he talks about. We're not going to get a specific plan from Victor, but I would hope that you and Lisa can come to us and say, okay, here's a plan you should consider that might get you there within 2 years, 4 years or something, you just can't leave us in the wind with these words without knowing what we can do to address what they're saying is a weakness. That's all.
Sure, and I'm totally sensitive to that, David, and I thought, that call we had with Victor was helpful, but he clearly is uncomfortable, and because it's not his role to be giving guidance to the community in terms of what it should do. He's sort of in the opinion business, so they're very sensitive to that. But I'm more than happy to tell you, with respect to reserves, you want upwards of 15% of available reserves to your general fund revenues, and over 20%. And Lisa will get into some of these metrics or comparisons with AAAs that I think might be helpful in terms of you'll see visually sort of where you stand versus your AAA Massachusetts communities. So, but I'm totally with you, and I'm more than happy to give you my 2 cents on all of these various things about what you should do or what would be helpful in terms of moving you toward that AAA, with the caveat that even if you do it, it's not a guarantee. It's not sort of an algorithm, but they look at all these things, but they also weigh other factors that are outside the community's control.
Peter.
No, I appreciate that, because I don't think we want to, I don't want to hurt the town by saying that our primary goal is AAA. I don't think anyone is saying, yeah, that's the charge. But if there is an attempt or a plan that we can try to afford to get there,
Sure.
even if it takes us a little longer, I would still think that we'd want to know what those recommendations are. Then it's up for us as a community to say, yep, we could probably take this or do this, and then we'll decide on an ongoing basis whether we want to get there or not.
I agree completely. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob.
I think a lot of what we do in terms of even just reviewing this information and putting this information forward, minimally, if we're doing good things to maintain our good AA rating, then that's a plus as well. Peter, last year, and Lisa might be getting into this, but one of the tools you brought forward last year was really interesting, was that credit scenario builder. I don't know if you have that available tonight, or but
we didn't update the Standard & Poor's indicative rating application. I think that's what you're referring to, where you put in the inputs and then it sort of spills out what the indicative rating is, subject to all their other adjustments. I don't think we've got that for you, but that tends not to change dramatically from one year to the next. So we're happy to do that as a follow-up, but I don't think it will tell you anything that's very different from last year.
Okay.
But what we can do is, Lisa's prepared this credit comparison data, some of which is the actual numbers are probably too small to be able to parse out on a PowerPoint, but you've obviously got it that you could print out and look at sort of where those numbers are coming from. But Lisa, is now a good time to have Lisa just walk through some of those graphs?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
So we put this comparative information together with the other AAA rated communities in Massachusetts. There are 76 AAAs between Standard & Poor's and Moody's Investors Service. So we added Norwood to this comparison that we have to show, the town's strengths and weaknesses as they compare to the other AAA communities. Like Peter said, the actual metrics that are on the first couple page are sort of like an eye chart. They're very small, but if the graphical representation of the metrics, I think, is what is really helpful to just get a quick look at where the town stands. And so we went through the different categories and metrics that S&P does look at when assigning a rating in terms of economics, debt, and finances. And I mean, some of the graph, I don't know if you have had a chance to look at this, or if you want to walk through every single graph. Some of them are fairly, self-explanatory, the per capita income type graphs and median family income. I think that, your point about, the roadmap, so to speak, to get to the AAA, the graphs on page 19 and 20 in terms of total fund balance as a percent of revenue and unassigned fund balance as a percent of revenue. The reserve position is really something that the rating agencies are really looking at, especially now, as Peter said, in this COVID era. And just, looking at where these other AAA communities are at in terms of their positions as a percent of their revenue. You can look at the straight up numbers, but unless you sort of put it in perspective and look at it as a percent of revenues or a percent of expenditures, you don't really get the whole picture. So looking at, I think, these two graphs is really very helpful to see that some of these AAA rated communities, their revenues, their fund balances and unassigned fund balances as a percent of their revenues are really very high, and it speaks to the strength of their credit rating. The graphs on the pension and OPEB are also interesting to look at. Those are on the end of the presentation, page 25 through 27. I'm sorry, 23 through 27. 23 showing just the static unfunded pension liability of each of the communities, and page 24 showing the unfunded OPEB liability, and then pages 25 and 26 showing those liabilities as a percent of general fund revenues, to again put it in perspective. And there's a lot to look at in these graphs and to consider. I don't know if you had specific questions, if you want to sort of take some time to digest this information. But again, all of the statistics presented in the first few pages are shown in these graphs, which is much easier way to look at the information.
Yeah, I think if we had, we'll get it and we will review it. I remember the report from last year. I think what struck me from last year's report was, it's interesting, when you think of AAA rated communities, oftentimes you think that they are, wealthier communities, and in most cases they are, than in comparison to Norwood. But, it kind of stood out to me that that we did have towns in last year's analysis that I consider fairly comparable to us, whether it be Watertown, Wakefield, Danvers, and Dedham. And I think last year's report showed us, did a nice job showing where we were stronger. And many of these metrics were as strong, if not stronger, than some of these AAA rated communities. But I think, where the weaknesses lie are exactly as you've indicated to this, the unassigned general fund balance comparisons are. But, the good news is for us, I think that for us, in comparison to last year, I think our most recent free cash is substantially better than it was in last year's report. Our pension liability at 77 or 80% is probably better than many of those AAA rated communities as well. So, but my opinion would be, I think we would want to have opportunity to take a look at this report, perhaps compare it to last year's report, and just see where we've made a little bit of progress in comparison to the other dozen or so communities. But I think for tonight, I think it's probably going to be pretty difficult to have too much of a discussion. They look like great graphs, but I know we all have eyes that are not kind of able to focus in on any individual chart. But I'll open it up to any other commentary from FinCom meeting members or the selectmen, as Tom and David have any questions. Very good. David.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This report, it's available from whom?
I think Mark or Tom has it on their computers. We're happy to send it directly, but I think, Tom, is this is residing on yours at the moment?
Yeah, hey, David, I can get a copy out to you. It's Mark Good.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, if you send it to me, I'll make sure the membership gets it.
Okay, we'll do.
And you got a comment? No? Okay. Is there
No,
anything else?
I just wanted to make sure we all got copies.
Yes. Anything else for Peter or Lisa at this time? All right. Peter and Lisa, thank you very much for taking us through this information. It's always educational, and it's just great information for us to have as Finance Commissioners. Really appreciate your time and your efforts at providing the detail to us.
Well, thanks for having us out here, and if there are any follow-up questions, obviously we're available.
I thought, David, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so just my follow-up to that is Peter and Lisa going to be asked to come back with some sort of outline of a roadmap to address issues that were identified in the S&P report?
We're happy to make suggestions.
I think that's fine. I mean, I think you were articulating one specific one a few minutes ago, and I think that kind of detail would be appreciated. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Donnelly, so
Yeah.
Everyone in the FinCom already has these presentations. I put them in your tablets today.
Okay.
And Mark Good said he would send it to Tom and David.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
I just asked to be copied on that email. This is Kelly. My FinCom tablet is not the most streamlined way for me to get information, so I'd appreciate it if I could get it emailed too.
I don't use my tablet. I turned it in. I use my own computer, so I will also need it as an email. And again, to piggyback on David's request is the one that I had asked earlier, to make sure that you take a look at that OPEB policy and see if there's something major that we need to adjust. Thank you.
Sure.
Peter, to me, you might not want to make it simple. Like, for instance, I'm just making up these numbers. If we're at 10 million in reserves and we need to get to 20 million in reserves, you might want to say, put in this much per year. If you want to fund it in 3 years and 5 years or 7 years, 10 years. I mean, you can make it as complicated as you want, but that's what it comes down to. It's putting away more money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else, folks? Seeing none. Peter and Lisa, thank you so much for coming before us today and presenting that information. Good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us. Have a good night. Happy holidays.
You too. If the committee would the next we have 2 items: the capital outlay and the airport, and I know we still have Russ and Mark in Mark Ryan and Russ McGuire in the wings there, and I apologize, guys, for keeping you online for such a long time, but we can swing into the airport businesses if the commission is interested in moving on to that agenda item. All right. So just as a way of background, I get myself organized here. For this year's report, I haven't developed a narrative report, and I really haven't had opportunity to spend a lot of time with Russ and Mark on their experience this past year at the airport. I have had a couple of conversations, and basically what I'd like to do is take you through the financial review charts. And there is a document I sent earlier today that has this information that you'll see in a moment. It also has the tables that I worked from to create this information. But so, by way of background, for several years now, I've been doing an annual review of each fiscal year's performance by the airport in the area of revenue generation, expenses, and the history of surpluses and deficits associated with the airport. If you recall, this was a suggestion made several years ago by former Commissioner Joe Greeley to take a look at the revenue and expense history using a couple of variations. One is strictly from the FY21 experience. That's the table of accounting information that's in the email to you, which basically shows you the revenue sources for fiscal year 20, what amount was raised for each of those items, and same for expenses. And finally, that accounting spreadsheet gives you the bottom line surplus or deficit figure for FY20. This particular chart we're looking at now is, if you go to chart number 1, I think it's the one before this. Yeah, chart number 1. All right. So here we have, in terms of the revenue and expenses for the 8-year period. Just very briefly, I know that Mark and Russ can chime in with information. FY20, we see that the airport was able to generate an operating surplus of $10,000. Did speak to Russ. This is actually good news. I think it's good news in that, like any business, the airport suffered a drop in business due to the pandemic, and the table of information for your revenue and expense by source that's in your email will tell you just how the different revenue categories were generated in FY20. A lot of the information in there, FY20 is, our largest source of revenue generation for the airport is through long-term leases and short-term leases. They represent, and basically they represent over 45% of the overall revenue generation from the airport. Our flowage fees for jet fuel, and our lease, the revenue that we make from tie-down leases were down this year. That is a combination of, yes, a drop in business during the pandemic. If people aren't flying as much as they were last year, we're not going to be generating flowage fees from our fuel sales on the airport. Additionally, the short-term leases are specifically the tie-down leases. These are leases we have with plane owners for tying down their aircraft on the tarmac at the airport, was down, and that is more a matter of this particular year because of some new lease arrangements resulting from the legal settlement really meant that the several tie-down leases needed to be terminated in order to free up space for the longer-term leases that were resulting from the settlement. So overall, a mixed, in spite of the drop in business and the changes in lease arrangements, the airport was able to generate a surplus this year. On this chart, so this is a chart that shows us a lot of dips in terms of surpluses in the gray line at the bottom. I will comment that in FY19 and FY20, in FY19 we actually had an operating deficit of $1,000. In FY20 we had a surplus of $10,000, a little less than we've had in past years. But one thing I would call your attention to as you look at the table of information is on the 8-year chart, is that in these past 2 fiscal years, the town has budgeted a lot more dollars towards matching grants than we have historically done. Last year was at a vicinity of $80,000, and this year was north of $50,000. That's important to note, that those are important grants that we apply for future construction on the airport. When we put those monies into matching grants, that represents about 5% of any project's total cost. The remaining 95% is funded through the Federal Aviation Administration as well as DOT. So you can really account for the dip in the surplus revenue because we're making those capital investments a little bit above and beyond than what we have in the past. So generally speaking, we see on actual expenses, we see revenues that are equal to or surpassing our expenses in general. So nothing surprising there. We're pretty consistent. On the next chart number 2. Chart number 2 is, if you recall, Joe Greeley had proposed a method of looking at the airport's ability to generate a consistent surplus. His theory was, if we were to look at our actual expenses and revenues and take out certain items that are above that will vary greatly from year to year, may have an impact from a standpoint of, well, projects will vary from year to year. Why don't we take out expenses associated with snow and ice removal, which can vary greatly from year to year, take out matching grants for our construction because they can vary greatly from year to year. And I have been doing that the last several years. This year, I decided that perhaps a better way of looking at that particular scenario is just to take the snow and ice removal costs over the 8-year period and say what would it look like if we just average the 8-year average of snow and ice removal. Do the same for the matching grants. And by the way, on the revenue side, we had 2 years in this 8-year period where we had a FEMA reimbursement, which was counted as revenue. So I've taken the 2 years that we had FEMA reimbursements and I also averaged them out as a revenue source. So those 3 items that in the past had a lot of variation, I've kept them in this model and I've only averaged them out so that we could see what the trend would yield. So the good news here is when we look at this trend, it's a very steady trend. It really, I think, demonstrates that the airport is capable of operating consistently at a break-even point or even generate a small surplus most years. You see the blue line and the orange line are fairly steady, straight, particularly the revenue line, pretty consistent across the board. And the same impact, again, we see it in the gray line at the bottom, which is our surplus. So we generate a surplus under this scenario. We have, just looking at this, again, a little dip up in the last couple of years for expenses, but our operating deficit and our operating surpluses are pretty steady. So that's the only thing we're trying to do in this particular graph. We can go to the third graph now. Yes, Kelly, go ahead.
The only thing I want to ask is, I know I've asked previously, and our legal fees that we expend on the airport are not included in those revenue numbers. And I know they make up a significant portion of the amount of legal litigation we have in a given year. So I just want to be careful about saying we turn a surplus, because if we actually look at the litigation against them, that might not be true. So I just want to be very, very careful with that.
And that's a point I'm going to speak to when we get to the third chart.
Well, rock on then.
So the third chart was an 8-year history where I built in some assumptions, and I'll get to that point, Kelly, in a moment. There are we do not operate, the airport does not operate as a entity, as an enterprise. You know, the revenues that they generate are go to our general fund, and the expenses they incur are paid for from the operating budget. However, there are, in addition, there are additional expenses that are not accounted for, if you will, in those scenarios, in that scenario from charts number 1 and 2. So this particular chart, I've done it before, is to try to embed into the overall cost a cost estimate of services that the town provides the airport that are not in the actual charges or the actual accounts balances from the previous 2 charts. So we know that the town provides an accounting and payroll services to the airport. We know that, I think this is still accurate, at least one of the employees has employee health insurance. There are, in the shared budget, there are insurance products for property liability insurance that the airport is part of. I use the term normal legal costs. So I want to be very clear to Kelly's point, this does not take into consideration the litigation costs that we've experienced at the airport for the last couple of years. Litigation, hopefully, will go away and will at least moderate over time. So when I say normal legal costs, there are years in the past where litigation has been at a minimum and our legal costs have been more than norm. So I just want to be, I'm glad you brought that up, Kelly. I do not want this to be seen as an analysis that's taking in that consideration. This is only looking at what if the airport was charged these various accounts, what kind of surpluses and deficits would they run from a historical basis. So here again, we do see that in general, the 8-year history average would tell us we'd still be running a surplus much smaller than it would be in chart number 2 and number 1. We do run an operating deficit, mostly again due to the impact of the matching grant expenses that we have in the last 2 fiscal years, which have been quite a bit higher than the norm has been over the years. So this is basically just trying to paint a picture as to what would the airport generate for the town in terms of revenue, in terms of surpluses or deficit, if we did have more of an enterprise way of looking at it. Again, with the caveat that we're not including in this the history of litigation over the past several years. Because if I turn this, if we were to do this chart from 10, 12, 13 years ago, we would have more normal costs associated with law and legal items than we do in today's world. So that's basically what we wanted to do here. I do have a list of notes here to go back to the chart number 1, if you could. I'm sorry, I'm going through this very quickly, and I apologize. If people have something to comment, just throw your hand up, and I'll talk about this. I have talked to Russ, and I know Mark has some information to share in terms of the future business development opportunities at the airport. But to go back to my to chart number 1, I did do a couple of bullets on my own. These will be included in the narrative when, after the first of the years, I will produce a narrative to kind of like summarize these things. So back to FY20, we had a airport generation of $451,000 in revenues. And those revenues are divided into 2 main categories, direct and indirect. Our direct revenues are our leases, our landing fees, fuel, flowage fees, and jet fuel tax. Our leases are those arrangements where we have with operators, like our fixed base operators on the airport. We lease them the land. They use it to build structures, hangars that they, thereby are able to operate their businesses. Landing fees were represented 8% of our revenues last year. The landing fees were an item that the airport was able to add to their fee structure a couple of years ago after our initial review of the airport finances and to our, they listened to our recommendations and established that. Short-term leases and I'm sorry. So the fuel flowage fees, you know, what happens there is that there is a percentage of fuel charge that the fixed base operators will collect from people buying fuel, and that ends up in as a revenue source for us. And our jet fuel tax, we take advantage of the state's jet fuel option for a local tax to also have the Department of Revenue return to us in this particular past year, return to us $36,185 that's collected generally from a tax on fuel. 70% of our revenue is from those direct sources. Our indirect revenues are FEMA reimbursements, which there only have been 2 in the last several years, and they're very dependent upon storm and emergency events. We do collect a pilot, actually it's probably, I think it's more of a lease arrangement with the BMA, that a long-term lease there that I think the gentleman from the airport can speak to. It's over $120,000 a year that we collected from them, and that's about 27% of our overall revenues. So on the expense side, salaries represent 44% of our expenses, which totaled $441,000 in FY21, with 41% being our operational expenses associated with utilities, equipment, facilities, things such as that, and capital, such as our matching grants and our investment in capital repairs, represents about 14.5%. One thing I will make note of is I think we're starting to see the benefit of savings in the rental area. The admin building, the Welch building, is up and operating. Russ is now in that building, and so we'll see a little tick up, I'm sure, in terms of our utility expense, but our rental expense will be moot at this point, since we no longer have the need to rent from one of the operators' space for our offices. So again, that's our quick look at our FY20 experience. Again, generating a surplus of $10,000 this year. Russ, did I mention? Is there anything else that you wanted to mention that I neglected to, given that very quick update?
Thanks, Chairman Donnelly and members of the FinCom. Several revenue streams that we anticipate in the next, actually starting soon. We have 2 aircraft tie-down aprons that were vacated back in April of 2019 as part of the ongoing litigation negotiation with Boston Executive Helicopters. This was a substantial parcel of land, prime real estate on the airport, about 86,000 square feet in total. And this is part of the negotiated leases with Boston Executive Helicopters. The commission will meet on Wednesday, and if all goes well, they'll execute those leases. What we expect from those leases in total is about $44,000 for the year. Another item that I know Chairman Ryan had passed along to the FinCom was that we have an ongoing construction project for an aircraft hangar. It's being privately financed by Flight Level. This is a hangar that is in the $750,000 to $1 million, and we would expect to get a percentage of that in property taxes once it's completed sometime in the coming year. We expect spring, summer of 2021 to have that project completed. And finally, I know Chairman Ryan also passed this along. We have a site plan that we've approached Mass DOT for some possible grant financing in the coming year. And this is for a restaurant office building. It's adjacent to the flagpole, if you're familiar with the airport park. Kind of overlooks the main runway. The engineering department has put together a lot of the preliminary plans, and what we would be looking to do is to actually go out to a developer to develop this with the possibility of establishing a second restaurant, some outdoor seating, There'll be a kind of a deck area that faces to the east, overlooking the main runway. And there would be some office space with the potential of servicing some airport users, such as rental car companies, flight schools, et cetera. So these are some of the directions we're looking in to increase revenue in the airport. And it's been a tough year, all things considered. Obviously, the pandemic has affected business, particularly initially in the late winter, early spring. Our traffic dropped off appreciably. And we saw that in the fuel flowage fees. The town gets 7 cents on the gallon for every gallon of fuel that's actually transported onto the airport. And we get bills of lading from Flight Level, which is the fuel provider on the airport. And the fuel flowage fees each month are determined based on the bills of lading. In the late winter, early spring, when the pandemic hit, the traffic, as I said, did drop off. It did recover nicely. We had the best October that we've had in 3 years, several months ago. So traffic is back up. We do think that this might be a reflection of the fact that folks are not, generally speaking, wanting to get onto the commercial airliners, but they're more apt to get onto a charter flight. And we certainly do a lot of charter flights out of Norwood. So we think that may in part be a reason why the traffic count has increased. I'm not sure if Chairman Ryan has anything to add to that, but I'm certainly open to any questions as well.
Thank you, Russ. Chairman Donnelly?
Hi, Mark.
Hey, Bob. Yeah, just, to touch on what Russ said, hopefully we go through with these leases, which I expect we will on Wednesday. $44,000 a year in annual revenue, which is a plus. The hangar that's being constructed could be anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 in additional revenue, which is a plus. You mentioned the new municipal building we have, the Major Mark Welch Administration Building. We aren't paying rent anymore, but our utilities went up, as you mentioned. But Energy New England did an energy audit, and the facilities department of the town of Norwood is going to be upgrading a lot of lights that were put in 2007. So they're projecting a $13,000 savings in utilities, which is great. The office complex that Russ talked about, adjacent to the airport parking lot, you're talking about a 3,500 square foot building with a overlooking the airport. You're probably talking another potential $20,000 in revenue. So we're keep moving forward, Chairman Donnelly, trying to increase revenue there, and we've done a pretty good job, I think, of doing that. I was hoping maybe in the report that we could recognize, we spent $59,000 in matching grants this year, and you mentioned, that's 5% of what the actual costs were. I was hoping you could talk to Russ about what we actually received in benefit from FAA and Mass DOT to improve our facility, which, by the way, has been estimated to be worth about $218 million. So these are all good numbers that it'd be great to put in the report, just to recognize how the airport works. And, it's not just, we made 10,000 or we lost a little bit of money. There's a lot of benefit there. And finally, I know last year's report, you recognize the economic impact report Mass DOT did on airports in 2019. And you had a link to it, which is great. But I think a couple of the bullet points are really important, that Norwood Airport generates $59.26 million in economic benefit to the area on an annual basis, 467 direct and indirect jobs, which count to about $19 million in payroll. So I was just hoping we could just throw that in as bullet points, just to recognize how well that airport does and what function it serves to the to not only Norwood but the surrounding area.
Yes, and I have done that in the past, and actually I had it on a sticky note here, the 467 total employment and the 19 million in total payroll and so forth. But yeah, it's the report from DOT is dated January 2019, so it's fairly recent. And yes, I will include it in the narrative as well, because above and beyond the revenues and expenses that the town incurs for operating the airport, there is certainly a substantive economic benefit to the area that cannot be ignored. Thank you, Mark. If I may, so I will produce a narrative report. I thought that this information was getting kind of stale, and I wanted to get it before folks today, and I apologize the full report's not available. I did have a couple of observations I wanted to just end with, but I wanted to just make sure we entertained any comment and questions from folks online right now. Is there anything else does anyone have anything else to add? So one thing that I'm going to suggest, and I'll probably put it in the narrative report. So I've been doing this report for like 4 straight years now, and I think next year we should consider perhaps a little change in the format. I think at this point, the subsequent charts, number 2 and number 3, I think we've kind of proven over the course of the last 4 years that there is a fairly steady stream of consistency in terms of our operating surpluses and deficits. And I think I think that those 2 charts, we probably can consider not doing the similar analysis and perhaps focus more on the business aspects that Russ and Mark had brought up, and that maybe our next report can be really more focused in the results of our business development opportunities at the airport, and maybe just kind of consider the historical analyses, things that may not be needed going forward. That's not just a selfish reason in terms of my own time and effort put towards this, but I'm just thinking at this point, when I was putting these charts together, I said that it really isn't telling a different story that we already been familiar with for the last several years. So that's food for thought for the next round of reporting this time next year. So anything else, folks? All right. I think we can let Mark and Russ go then. Thank you, Mark and Russ. Thank you for hanging in there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I think that brings us to our last item on the agenda. And I think we talked a little bit about Ellen. I think this goes to the point you made earlier, and I believe Ann requested. Ann, why don't you speak to the outlay item? I think you had some observations that you'd like to share with the commission, if you could. Is that all right? Am I putting you on the spot?
Yeah, you did, but that's okay. Which one of my great ideas was I supposed to be talking about here?
I think you put this on because I think you wanted to have a little discussion in terms of how a capital outlay, how we outline, I think this goes to the issue of what does our policy say about capital item in reference to vehicle replacement, and what are the other ways that we might want to consider categorizing our outlay expenses. And I think this goes back to the long list of items that we had at the town meeting in November. Does that refresh your memory?
That refreshed my memory, and you said it well.
All right, thank you.
So no, I have some concerns, especially when we got the report about our from the S&P people, that, you know, again, it keeps coming back, and it's very subtle, and it's a small thing, but, you know, we do need to get to putting those vehicles into the regular budget instead of in capital outlay. And I was actually sat down during this, I guess maybe it was the fall, and I counted them, and I said, I don't ever remember seeing this many vehicles in a capital budget. And I mean, we had dump trucks for this and dump trucks for that and dump trucks for the other thing. And I thought it was like really gone past where it should have been. You know, something once in a while, maybe some unexpected thing, but yeah, there was an awful lot of vehicles in that capital outlay budget. So just wanted to throw it out there. See if we can get together and take a look at maybe the policy or something, and see what we can do about it. Keep it in the backs of our heads when we start looking at the budgets.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll do that. Anyone else on capital outlay? Very good. I do believe we have reached the part of our agenda where I can move on to other business. I'm sorry. Thank you for putting this up, Tom. I'm under other business. Tom has an update to us regarding our free cash certification. Thank you, Tom.
So somebody asked, where are we in free cash? So this comes from the tax recap. And basically we had free cash certified of $8,725,025. For items at the fall town meeting, we spent $1,185,158. That was primarily related to the schools and associated costs. And then prior to town meeting, I had contacted Division of Local Services and said, hey, what are we going to be able to put on the tax recap for hotel tax and for meals tax? Because, you know, the usual rule is you can put 100% of the previous year. And so the person, Kim from DLS, said, oh yeah, you can put 100% of the previous year. So when we were calculating how much cash we needed to balance the budget, we needed using that approach, we needed $618,232. And then we actually just finished the recap today. It hasn't been approved yet because they have their system crashed in the state. But basically they came back and said, hey, you have to lower your hotel motel tax by $325,000. And so basically, and then the place that their recap, because you can't change things that were appropriated, you know, when we did votes. So they just automatically take it out of overlay. So when we go to the January town meeting, we need to restore that overlay and probably right out of free cash. So it's about $329,000, I think, to bring it up to the $1,040,000 that we had in the budget. So even though this says we have $6,009,000, consider that we probably have $6,006,000 by the time we do that.
Still a pretty healthy free cash number, all things considered. So good. Any questions about free cash, folks? Thank you for the update, Tom. Anything else under other business? Well, I think we've conducted all our business for this evening. I'll get the input from commissioners. I didn't think that there was anything urgent that we needed to meet before the end of the year. unless folks want to put forward, but I think, I don't see anything on the horizon that needs our attention. Yes, Ann?
Well, don't we have to, okay, so we will have to vote on the move of the money to capital, not capital outlay, to the outlay budget?
Yeah, when Bernie goes through his list of items for that town meeting, which is still a month away, his list is probably a month away, then that will be one of the items that you would consider.
Okay,
But of course, the assessors need it, so.
Right. And
Yeah.
we would also need to meet, because I don't believe we took a vote on the community preservation projects, or did we? I'd have to go back and look.
I thought,
My recollection is I don't think we did. So we would definitely have to have a meeting prior to special town meeting to
Okay.
approve it, the overlay and as well as the CPC projects.
all right, and what are we doing about the proposed calendar of events for town meeting?
Proposed calendar for,
The plan is Tony's going to fill in the calendar over the next 2 or 3 weeks and then get it back out to people as a draft.
Okay,
and that would make it available then for further discussion when we do meet in January prior to special town meeting. We have opportunity at that point to look at the proposed calendar. Sounds like a plan. Yes, Judy.
I was just wondering, what's the update or the latest regarding holding town meeting and holding a virtual and maybe in person too, whoever wants to go? Does anybody have any idea?
Well, I know that hybrid meetings are not allowed by law, so you have to have either a virtual meeting or an in-person meeting, and I'm quite sure it's going to be a virtual meeting.
Okay,
I spoke to Dave Hearn within the last week, and he's doing a lot of due diligence and checking things out. And as Tom said, that probably be a virtual meeting, but there's a lot of work involved, and Mr. Hearn is doing a good job.
Very well. And if no one else has any new business to bring forward, I think I'll take this opportunity to wish everybody happy holidays and also entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion to adjourn. And I also want to say happy holidays to everybody.
Thank you, Judy. We have a motion to adjourn from Judy. Do I have a
I'll
second?
second it.
All right, and seconded. Roll call vote for adjournment. Ann Haley,
Yes.
Judy Langone,
Yes,
Alan Slater.
Yes, and also happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you, Alan. Kelly Numi.
Yes, and I will ditto the happy holidays to everybody.
Do I need a separate motion for happy holidays, maybe? I will vote in favor of adjournment as well, folks. Thank you very much. And we'll see you soon.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bob, thank you.